Welcome back. I hope you feel re-energized after the lunch. I also hope that you noted that you've eaten vegetarian food all along on purpose. Now, I would like to introduce the chair for this afternoon session, my friend and colleague, Karin Bäckstam, the professor in political science, who's transitioning right now from Lund to Stockholm University. Karin has also been instrumental in pulling this event together, so I'm taking all the credit, but I shouldn't, because Karin is equally responsible for this event. So it's a great pleasure to hand over the word to you, Karin.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor to chair this session. So now we are venturing into theme 2, that is to discuss the direction of the scholarship of climate governance after Copenhagen. What did Copenhagen mean in terms of the academic study? What has it meant for the theories, methods, epistemologies? Definitely Copenhagen was also a kind of earthquake for the scholarship. So that's what we're gonna discuss now, and we are very happy to have two excellent, very prominent speakers on this theme. First out is Frank Biermann, and he doesn't need much introduction, but I will introduce him. He's a professor in political science at Free University at Amsterdam. He's also an adjunct professor at Lund University, chair of the Earth System Governance Project, and has written extensively on the global environmental governance. And I would say it's a more optimistic voice in the and a much needed voice to assess the state of global environmental governance. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I have to say I have to get used a little bit to this machine here, which is quite a funky. You almost feel like go on a space shuttle now. Anyway, thanks a lot for the introduction and welcome back after lunch, excellent vegetarian lunch, to the second part. So these presentations are not about climate governance in the past. They're not about Copenhagen or Durban or Doha or Paris or any other of these meetings. They are about a more general perspective on what the next generation of research questions could be. And I think in this way also very much related to the 10 years anniversary of the center. I think the center is a great achievement. I'm very pleasured and honored to be here. I think it's a great workshop also, and I think now we are talking not about the last 10 years, but about the next 50 years of Center's history and what could be the question that we couldn't address. And I don't have them all, I just have some funky ideas, or not funky ideas, about what questions could be. And I have 8 questions, or 8 areas that I want to discuss in my talk. The one is more about the conceptualization and the context. About normativity is a second. I talk again about multilateralism and transnationalism. I talk about legitimacy, equity, adaptation, and then 2 more cross-cutting areas. The one is what is a social scientist today in a context that is determined by natural sciences, which are the majority in the mainstream in our field in a way. And then finally I talk a bit about global research and what it means for social scientists, how they can act and interact in a larger global change research context. Starting about the conceptualization, and that's one thing that's, I think, very important to me, is one of my emerging hobbies in the end, to try to rethink what the emergence of the Anthropocene means for us as environmental researchers. I mean, there are in a way 2 ways of dealing with the concept of the Anthropocene. You can say this is just a joke, in a sense, just an idea, it's just a new PR gag from some natural scientist or from journalist to have a new term to get more research funding. But you can also see it as a transformation of our understanding of what's going on the planet. And I tend to be part of the latter camp. I tend to believe that the idea of the Anthropocene is a fundamental change of the way how we understand our role as environmental researchers, our role as people in the environmental studies community. I frankly believe that the world environment is no longer capturing what we are actually facing. I think the world environment means, in a sense, it's a dealing with the environment of the human species, the environment of human settlements, and I think this is 1970s. I think what we are now dealing with is a fundamental transformation of the entire planetary system as captured in this term Anthropocene, a new epoch in planetary history. And what this means for us as former environmental scholars or former environmental studies people, I don't know. But I think it's very important for our community to come to terms with these kind of things, to come to terms with an understanding of what this transformation of the planet, in a sense, the capture of the planet, the taking planet over by human species, what it means for us as scholars, from everything, from ethics to governance to all kinds of other communities. I mean, the Anthropocene is captured in all of these graphs that are showing, I mean, some people describe it as a great acceleration, where you see that essentially everything that you have there is going up. I mean, including the natural science, well, climate, of course, but there are also these graphs, you can't see it here, McDonald's, whatever, telephone use. Everything has changed in a sense like the 1950s. And we have to understand what this means for our community. So I think what our community has to face and understand is this transformation in the last 10,000 years from a Holocene state, where at one point we kind of emerged and took over the landscape, colonized 40% of land use, up to a co-evolution at the country scale. This is the Netherlands. I love to show it because it really shows as one part of the globe that is totally dominated by human species. In a way, the concept of Anthropocene is now capturing the same development at the global scale. And the question I have for social scientists, from this center, for all centers, it means, are our governance systems ready to deal with this transformation? Are our political systems ready to deal with this transformation? And my answer is no. My answer is that our political systems essentially operate in especially at the global level, at the national level, they operate in the same framework of the 19th century. I like to show these two pictures. This is from 1815, the Vienna Congress. This is from Copenhagen, of course. And the question is, what has changed? Not much. The only change is at that time, in the old days, everybody was white, everybody was male, everybody was speaking French. But these are kind of the only three transformations you have. For the rest, I believe that our current governance system in many fundamental ways is still determined by structures that we developed in the 19th century. And this has to change. So what has to happen in a way, it's one of my first claims, I made this yesterday also a bit, that we have to change our thinking. And I think our research community has to open up to much more radical thinking, to much more bold ideas. We had some of them, we had this morning, we had a lunch discussion about Robin's idea of having a non-proliferation treaty for carbon, or Markus Lederer came up with the idea of lunch, they have a crowdfunding for Indian non-coal use, whatever. So I mean, these are kind of the ideas we need to develop. They're difficult to develop because our universities are not really paying us for that. I mean, our university systems are against new ideas, they're against bold ideas because they have this kind of very restricted way of functioning. But I think one conclusion is this is very important that we engage in these kind of activities. Which leads to my second point, and I think that's a very important point. Anthropocene means that we have to reconsider the normative foundation of what we are doing. As if we accept that we as humans are no longer reacting to the environment, but that we are now a race that is shaping the planetary developments to some large extent, that means we have to think about what we want to do with the planet. And this is a question we may say we don't want to have this question. We say we want to opt out of this question, but it's not possible. We have to deal with this question of how we want to have our Earth. And that's a very difficult question. So, I mean, there's this new debate about the good Anthropocene. It's a very interesting debate where people say, I like this, where there's one scientist, his name is actually Frank, good. I mean, he says whatever, he says what I kind of just said. I mean, this is the other Frank. So he says, I mean, they have this disruption of natural systems, and all this has been called Anthropocene, human dominate. And there's this guy who is kind of probably an economist, whatever, or a guy from the magazine, The Economist, because they wrote an article like this in that way. And he says, well, this is great, the Anthropocene. Go humans, go humans. What do you mean? In your face, you Holocene losers. No? And he says, the trouble with you, Frank, is that you just can't bring yourself to celebrate achievement. Because in this way, they say the Earth is something you can control. It's a great place. We are out of the caves, we are out of the jungles, we are living here in warm, nice places, and we can have to shape the planet like we shape our gardens. This is kind of the discourse of the good Anthropocene. So the question is, and I think Steve will also agree with me on this point, that this is a way I don't like it. I mean, I'm not on this camp. I don't believe in the good Anthropocene because I believe in uncertainty. I believe that we are not able to fully understand the system. I believe that we are not able to fully control the system. So therefore, I'm much more humble as a human species, in a way, as a human person on this planet. And I think we should not go in the celebration of achievement. We should be conservative and find ways normatively to kind of limit our impact on this planet. But then the question is, how do we do this? For all Swedes, of course, very well known the planetary boundaries concept. This is one attempt, in a way, to define a couple of boundaries that that circumvent in a way the action space of human species on planet. And this was cooked up at a workshop in Stockholm long time ago, or not that long time ago, and has been very influential in some parts. It has been very much also fought against at the Rio conference, Rio +20. So it's very controversial. The idea is that there are certain quantitative indicators, threshold values, so once we are passing those, the planet will switch to new kinds of operation. It has been very much criticized by developing countries because they said this is easy to put together when you are a natural scientist from a rich country in the north. It's much more difficult to defend from a developing perspectives because many of these boundaries are very debatable. Like here's this one global freshwater use. I mean, how can you set a value for global freshwater use in a world where you have many people? I mean, 1 billion people doesn't have sufficient drinking water. The same for energy. The same for land use, which you have here, global land use. How can you set a boundary for global land use in a world where 842 million people don't have sufficient food? These are very important questions. This is what I mean. These are the questions we have to address as former environmental scholars by understanding what is our normative role in the on the planet, in the Anthropocene. The counter, I mean, the slide is not that good or not sufficient for this big dome here. This is a counter model, has been brought forward by Oxfam, where they said there are planetary boundaries, which is the outside, but then inside the planetary boundaries, you have also social boundaries. So we have to not only protect us from transgressing planetary boundaries such as ozone layer, such as water, whatever, we also have to protect the human boundaries in a way which is health, which is food, which is water provision for humans, which is all jobs and many other issues. So in a sense, politically, we have to combine these two. And this is a tremendous challenge. And I think this is a challenge we have to address for any paper we write. Because for any paper, any book, any project we do in our community, we have to somewhat address the normative activity. And this is a very important and very difficult. One practical example is the ongoing discussion on sustainable development goals. And this is really where it becomes practical. This is this new debate in the UN context, and their important question for the environmental community is how do you bring in environmental or earth system concerns into the sustainable development goals? How do you bring them in? Do you want to have a standalone goal on environmental issues or on the earth system? Do you want to have a cross-cutting theme? And this is one of these discussions where it really becomes very concrete. What are the normative assumptions? What are the normative ideas that we have when we talk about sustainable development and an earth system governance? So then I come to my third point, third research area. And it's also one of my hobby, I like it very much. It talks this debate about our community with what I call is multilateralism versus, I call them the forget the UN people. I think they're both in the room and many of us are both at the same time sometimes, whatever, depending on the form. So that's kind of the core idea is there are some people out there who believe that we still have to work very much on the UN system and try to reform and try to focus on the Paris Agreement, and many other people are saying forget this entire UN process, this is just a waste of time, a mega multilateralism, get out of it and try to look at different agreements. An example is, I mean, this is this Cohen Victor slide, many of you have seen this, where he showed this entire regime complex in which the UN is only one actor or one institution, I mean many others, and interestingly here also the size of the bullet or the square around the UN legal regime, exactly the same size as all the others are. This shows in a way a new approach in the sense that the UN is one approach, the UNFCCC is one approach, but many others can carry to the same direction. So if you want to characterize the two camps, multilateralism is about relevance of the UN system, it's about focusing on the UN system and these kind of approaches, and focusing still on governments as the key decision-making actors. Transnationalists, on the other hand, kind of try to focus on the new terrain. They focus on local policy experiments, they focus on non-state actors, they focus on governance by NGOs, as Michelle has called it yesterday, and put all their hope and many of their aspirations in bringing in all other communities, civil society, cities, and business. So what to do with this? I think this is my experience in the last couple of years, that these are almost like two tribes emerging, two research directions, and you find it also in this workshop because the panels were kind of divided. There were one panel on non-state and some panels on climate negotiations. So in a sense, I think what we need at the current state, and this is, I think, big challenge for the next couple of years, is to bring these communities together, to merge the two tribes, and to bring them more into interaction. Which is, on the one hand, Point one is to have a much more comprehensive assessment of the overall effects of local and transnational activities. We have lots of case studies, we have lots of smaller studies on different approaches, whatever, like Forest Stewardship Council, all these kind of approaches, there are studies on their effectiveness, but the overall system on outside the UN governance, we have to assess what the effectiveness of these activities is. There are some examples. There's this new project, Leverhulme project, Harold Berkeley et al. With 60 project that they have studied together, but I think we can do much more. We have much more of these assessments to really see what's the difference that these kind of organizations and activities make. Secondly, what is the indirect effect? And I think that's very important. When we want to address the Anthropocene, we have to talk about changes in human behavior. We have to understand changes in human values and in human ways of dealing with the environment. And so the question is, to what extent can these activities, Frank Fischer talked yesterday about transition towns and eco-villages, to what extent can these maybe small-scale activities reform the way how we think about the environment? How can they change behavior of humans? How can they change values? I think this is a very interesting research question. And this could be effects that are much beyond what these activities reach in terms of emission reductions. I think that could be interesting place. Certainly, how can public policy deal with these issues, support these kind of initiatives? And then I think a very important question is, how can we see these transnational approaches and the multilateral approaches in tandem? How can we see them working together, jointly developing a climate governance or any other architecture that is effective in the long run? How can we kind of bridge these divide? And the last point is, I think that's a point for the multilateralists, and I met several of you in the last day who kind of identify themselves as multilateralists. I mean, it's kind of, how can we kind of work together, how can multilateralists work together to get more effective and much more dynamic governance systems at the international level? In a sense, how can you make the UN system much more effective? I think that's an important question, and here we really need bold ideas to initiate discussion processes among governments. And one thing that I think is one of the most fascinating areas is to find qualified forms of majority voting. I think that could be, I mean, more than 70% of all multilateral environmental agreements are based on consensus, and we know, I mean, it's a no-brainer that consensus means that the least interested party is dominating the outcome, more or less. So majority voting is much more effective in a way that you get much quicker, larger coalitions of countries with much more ambitious agreements. The question is, can you just have the UN system with one country, one vote? This is kind of a proposal of Papua New Guinea and Mexico and some other countries. They just said, let's just have majority voting, just have 2/3 or 3/4 majorities in the climate system. And I think what we have to do as governance scholars, social scientists, we have to engage in a much more intense debate on what other alternatives are there for majority voting, going beyond the old style one country, one vote. Because one country, one vote means that theoretically 5% of human population have the majority. And these are all the people who live in small countries. Theoretically, this is kind of a majority. You need 5% of human population and you have the majority in the UN General Assembly. And this is something that big countries will never accept. This is one of the reasons why we have the G20. That's one of the reasons why we have the G7, G8 and all these kind of agreements. Because this system where small countries can dominate big countries is no longer, it's not fitting for any meaningful discussions and meaningful decisions. But what else? Democracy theorists might say one country, one vote per person, but then you come up with the result that 7 countries only have the majority, and 186 countries are the other 50%. Again, this is something that most countries will not accept. So what we need, I mean, the same you could do also for other indicators like GDP or any other indicators that weights the relevance of a country. There's always countries that are against it. I think what we need, and there's very, very few literature on it, we need new thinking about how we can develop much more sophisticated, much more convincing, integrated systems of qualified majority voting. And that can be some different kind of votes for different issue areas. It can be combined areas, it can be layered majorities. For certain issue areas, you have different kind of majority requirements. I think these could be some of the ways forward to deal with these kind of issues. Then another point, number 4, is that I think we face tremendous problems of accountability and legitimacy in international governance. And this affects both the UN system, such as the UNGA, but also all climate agreements that are driven by governments and driven by bureaucrats from governments. But it's the same also for non-state governance, which has the same, I mean, all these non-state governance agreements, this is like the Maritime Stewardship Council, have developed very elaborate decision-making procedures. They have, to some extent, a certain level of effectiveness. But the question is, what is the accountability, legitimacy of these bodies? I mean, who has ever voted for Unilever, who have ever voted for Worldwide Fund for Nature and these mechanisms that are setting up non-state governance? So I think both the state system and the non-state system face tremendous questions of legitimacy, accountability. And the question is for us, I think, as researchers, what can we do? I mean, how can we kind of combine this? How can we develop new ways of legitimatizing and accountability support for governance at the global level? And this becomes much more important. And there are three ways of thinking about it, which we kind of discussed at one Earth System Governance Conference in Lund in a way. I think there's three different models. One model is to bring in civil society in a sort of representative model to give it more vote. I mean, right now, civil society has the right to be heard. The question is, can we bring them in some way that they have really meaningful representation in a form of voting in a way? I mean, not voting, it could be also some stronger way of delaying action, some stronger way of finding support. The Commission on Global Governance in '95, they have proposed a forum of civil society in the UN system with 600 people, representatives of civil society. The UN is kind of experimenting right now with this major groups approach, which could be some form of representation. And you could think about the same in climate governance, bringing in, like Sebastian showed this organigram on climate governance this morning. You could add some forum of civil society. The question is, of course, who is sitting in it? I mean, the UN would probably adopt the 9 major groups, which is a totally unrepresentative thing. I mean, they have the youth, they have the farmers, they have scientists, they have whatever, industry and labor. So, I mean, many of us are not represented, not fully represented, and it was a totally arbitrary process how these 9 major groups have come up. I discussed it with some civil society people, and they say they know that the idea of 9 major groups is crazy, but they have to stick to it, because if they kind of start discussing it, then the entire system will break down, because there's nothing better they can have. Anyway, this is one way. The other way is to bring in parliamentarians. I mean, most countries or most people on the planet are now represented in parliamentary democracies to some degree. So here you could think about to have a system of representation of parliaments, national parliaments in the UN system. There's this idea about United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, or to have the same in the climate system. The question that comes up here is, of course, I mean, how many parliamentarians you want to have. That comes back to the majority systems of voting that I had discussed earlier. And the third idea is John Dreisig et al.'s idea to have deliberative forum. And he has one paper recently about the global assembly of citizens, which is only deliberative and is based on random selection. And he makes this big argument of saying, don't have representation in forms of civil society, don't have democratic representation in terms of parliamentarians, just have a random selection of citizens all over the place, put them together in one room, give them translators, give them some explanation about what the system is, the problems are, and then they will come up with solutions that are much better than what, with all due respect, our negotiators would ever come up with. And these are the 3 options. I don't have a clear preference for the one or the other. I know Chuck is working on these issues, but I think this is important issues to think about, because we have to move away from a system that is totally dominated from governments and a system that is totally dominated from government bureaucrats. We have to somehow bring in citizens in some new form to make our governance systems more effective, more legitimate, and more accountable. Equity is my 5th point. I think this is very important. And this is a point that I believe is totally underrepresented in the OECD discourse on all of these issues. Climate change is one of them, including this workshop, actually. I mean, the word allocation, word of equity, distributive outcomes was, I think, not sufficiently represented. Maybe I'm biased. I think we need much more discussions on these kind of issues to understand the world as a place that is inherently unequally divided. I mean, we have 76% of private consumption of the planet is taking over 20% of the planet. And this is that in developing countries has not gone unnoticed. So this is one of the key issues that we have to discuss. We just can't run around in Davos and all these places and say we can't choose like this lady does. We can't decide between the hunger panel and the poverty panel. So we have to really address this in a much more meaningful way. And I think this is a very important research question, because I think many of the questions that we are discussing in our community in the OECD countries largely is essentially an equity question, but we just don't address it as such. For example, there's discussion of like what is global, what is local, adaptation. Is it a local question, is it a local, global question? Desertification, is it local, is it global? These sound very academic questions, but in a sense they're questions about equity. Once you frame it as a global issue, it becomes an issue also for the North. Once you frame it as a local issue, that means the Africans can resolve it themselves. I think this is kind of a academic debate which boils down to equity. It boils down to allocation between rich countries and poor countries. The same can be said maybe for this debate about multilateral approaches or small N approaches, or even the role of NGOs is in a sense also an equity issue. I mean, giving more role can also be seen in a way critically from developing countries, because most NGOs are funded by industrialized countries, which give a much larger voice to people from wherever, Netherlands, Sweden, many other countries, which are totally overrepresented in the global NGO community because they are paying for them. Independence of science. You could also see it this way. I mean, 90% of the scientists in climate research are from industrialized countries. So saying, let the scientists have a totally independent role means giving citizens from those countries a strong role based on science. I don't say that everybody is biased just because you're living in the Netherlands like me, but it is an issue that can also be framed in terms of equity, even if it is a very innocent discussion. So I think it's much more important in future research, especially in the OECD countries, to factor in considerations of equity, fairness, justice, allocative outcomes, distributive outcomes of governance. I think that's one of the key questions that we have to address. Number 6. That's, I think, also very important, has also not been that much addressed at this meeting, except for the talk of Frank Fischer and some others, in a sense. We have a lot of research on local adaptation. I mean, Richard Klein is here, many others are really kind of working on this for 20 years. But I think what we really have to address is, first, a global warming scenario that goes beyond 2 degrees, maybe. And it's certainly related to this also a question of global adaptation governance. I mean, what does 3-degree or 4-degree warming scenario potentially means for global governance? I mean, in Holland, we have many studies and trying to understand what it means for the Netherlands, and we have a plan B and a plan C, etc., and what to do if we have a 2, 3, 4-degree warming scenario. But I think we need also to understand the entire UN system, the entire global governance system in terms of global adaptation governance. And I think there's very, very little research is being done to think through the impacts of an excessive climate change scenario for all areas of global governance: food governance, health governance, water governance, security, etc. I mean, I've tried a bit to do some, well, this is how we do it in the Netherlands, I just mentioned this, whatever. So we have a full plan ahead. Anyway, so this is a 4-degree scenario. But I did some research, not related to the Netherlands necessarily, is about climate migration, climate refugees, which is one area I found at one point interesting, to look at all these studies that are predicting how many people might be forced to be climate refugees, climate migrants by 2050. I mean, most of these figures, I mean, you see the huge variation from 1 billion to 200 million. Probably these figures are all slightly exaggerated because of modeling issues, because of the assumptions that are there. So I think many of these climate migration scenarios are overly pessimistic, but it's clear that sea level rise will cause a major migration issue. So I think that's very important to think this through from a governance perspective. So I have done a little bit of research on this, but there are many, many other issues that I think are very important to look at. I mean, provision of water, food, coastal zone planning. I think these are fundamental issues for global governance, and we really have to think through excessive climate change from this perspective. Good. These were 6 different points for the topics of research that could be interesting, or some ideas, and the call for bold and radical ideas that we can discuss. I mean, getting out of the box and having radical new thinking. But I have 2 points about more the cross-cutting issues of research. And the one is for social scientists, as in the center here in Linköping and other places, is a relationship to the natural sciences, which are extremely dominant. I mean, that's what you all know. And I work a lot with international research programs where the research programs of the social science are all now abolished, and we're all integrated into larger projects with natural scientists together. That means by default, we are minorities. By default, we will be in situations where we be in meetings such as this, and they are kind of 90% natural scientists, great people, friendly people, funny people, but they have different perspectives. And then they're kind of 10% social scientists from all kinds of disciplines, and they're trying to fix these issues. The question is, what can we do? I mean, how can we work on this? So in a way, I think there are two different communities. One is this model-driven, computer-driven, natural science approach, quantitative, computer-driven. And the others is what I would say is what we do. I mean, most of us here in the room, to the extent that I know you, are researchers who work on qualitative, a little bit databases, statistics also, but largely we're working on cases, we work on case studies, we have our more qualitative social science methodologies, and we are sitting then in a totally different universe. How can we work together? Can we work together? That's number one. Should we work together? Then secondly, if we want to work together, how can it happen? To what extent can we integrate research on governance, on institutions, on power, legitimacy, justice, democracy, all these issues? How can we integrate this in a computer model? I have no idea. What I did, and this I want to report here in 2 slides if I have the time, is we did a little experiment in Holland, which was a lot of fun. We got money, that's always the first bit, how it starts, from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency to do what is called Modeling Institutions and Governance for Global Sustainability. And that was, the core idea was we take a computer, open it up, and then in it we put the entire knowledge of the International Human Dimensions Program of Social Science, which is essentially, in our case, was the international relations. I mean, all these regime studies. I mean, we started very simple. All these books we have on international regimes, I mean, Oren Young in a sense. So we always had put Oren Young in the computer, kind of, whatever, and many others in your community. And it was fun. I mean, kind of, we did this a little bit. So then we came up with 2 things. I mean, problem structure. Stein Andresen is here. We kind of like this in a sense. We said, this is one thing where social science really can contribute. We can make a classification of problems between difficult problems and less difficult problems. And then we have lots of hypotheses and findings maybe on regime design. I mean, these were the kind of 2 things we had. And our core idea was that we kind of quantify this with fuzzy logic, put this into a computer language, and then we run this computer, maybe even for decision makers in a sense, whatever. And then at some point the computer might say difficult problem, and then there might be at some point climate change, whatever, you have really a very serious situation. That was a little bit our vision, how we had it. I mean, that's how it worked out. I mean, this is how the entire model was based, with different rules, problem structures, regime environment. We had in a sense 50 rules. I mean, that's kind of how we kind of synthesized the entire knowledge. I mean, the results, of course, are very, I mean, these are some examples how we defined rules. So if you have a collaboration problem, then regime formation is less likely, etc. That's kind of, well, you know all this literature from the 1990s, essentially. The findings are, it's totally experimental. It's kind of more fun in a sense to play around. It provided actually correct results in a sense. I mean, we could prove with our model that ozone, there should have been a regime and forest there should not have been a regime. But this is of course not surprising because the entire literature is based on the ozone and the climate regime. So it's very normal in modeling in the sense that what you put in, you also get out. So, but we were still very proud and had a lot of beers afterwards when the computer gave us this result. But the point is, I think this is something that in 50 years from now, I mean, kind of next generation, it could be interesting. I think we saw us, like those people in the 1940s who developed the first computers. I mean, I showed this one of these photos of this guy in the beginning, where these huge computers were running for 2 days, and then they told you that 2 times 2 is 4, whatever. So this is kind of what we see our state. And I think there is a future. I mean, it has lots of problems. We have to criticize it also. And what could be an option is what we call the wiki approach in a sense, because our money is finished actually. So the idea is, I mean, that more people are joining in, refining this, and then you really build this in. So my conclusion on this part is, I think it's totally crazy, but I think there is a way, in a way, to maybe bring in more governance research, even in natural science computer problems. Last point, Karen is very good. Last point is related to this last point. This point is related to my last point. It's about natural science integration. It starts with the strong conviction that I have that we have to really work together at a global level. I mean, that's what I tell always my students in a way. I mean, the old days, 19th centuries of science, you're sitting in your Chesterfield sofa, you're reading a book, you're writing a book, you read a book, you write a book, and you smoke a cigar. This is totally over. The problems are so complex that even all these smart people in Linköping can't resolve them themselves. So we have to work together in global research networks. And this is something that the natural scientists have invented in the 1950s in a way where they really said, if you want to understand an ocean current, if you want to understand Antarctica, whatever, we have to work together with thousands of people, put all the data findings together. That means we need a science plan, we need a steering committee, we need money, whatever, all these kind of issues. And social scientists are extremely late and extremely slow in adapting to this. But we have, in a way, so we have, these are the global change programs we have. These are really huge. This is kind of the World Climate Research Program, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which is still run by Stockholm, Diversity for Biodiversity Sciences, IHDP, International Human Dimensions Program. This was kind of where we were supposed to be represented. These are major programs, especially natural scientists, where thousands of people work together. And huge activities, big conference, etc., which all collaborated at one point in the Earth System Science Partnership. And I mention this in a little bit as a historical fact because this entire structure has been abolished this year. Abolished in this year because the funders, including I think the Swedish funders, many other funders, believed that this is too much separation. Belief was that the climate scientists should not have their own company and the social scientists should not have their own program. It was felt that this kind of social scientists having their social Human Dimensions program is outdated. So they said we have to join the party and become part of the larger activities which are now called Future Earth. And Future Earth is the program. There's nothing left. I mean, this is kind of the one program where all global change research, natural and social science together will be functioning. Future Earth has currently been set up. They have not defined now a secretariat. And I know that there are at least 2 Swedish cities actually that are bidding in 2 competing consortia for the secretariat of having this. And I know that the Swedish taxpayer is putting a lot of money in this activity. And it's great. I mean, that Sweden is really pushing for these things. So you might have the secretariat maybe in Stockholm. It's kind of one of the possibilities. And secretariat means in this case big. This will really be big organizations because they have to manage global change research of thousands of people. And I want to review this in my last couple of minutes from a social science perspective, because this is kind of part of my business. I run this Earth System Governance project where I have to go to these meetings and then negotiate, in a sense, with natural scientists about what we can contribute and on what terms and what to do. And there are lots of problems, or let's say challenges. Now, challenges that we might have as social scientists working in these issues and these kind of networks. This is kind of what Plan for Future Earth is about. I mean, this is kind of what they all want to do. They want to study why the global environment is changing, future change, assessing the implications for humans, the choices that we can make. This is the social science part, enhanced resilience, and also they want to support decisions for sustainable development. So in a sense, they want to do it all. They want to understand the problems, they want to understand human well-being, and they want to provide responses and governance options. And that's all what is there. And then they come up with a couple of design principles. And this is kind of principles how research should be designed. And when they say how research should be designed, they mean all of you. They mean all the centers, they mean the PhD students, they mean the projects, they mean the funding agencies. They say they want to have a step change in science. We want to have a step change in how science is being conducted in the future for the next 10 years. And this is a call for everybody from the funding agency, institute directors, and PhD students. And I can run to some of these principles. And the one is, of course, simple. They say we want to have excellent science, which is pretty straightforward. But what does it mean for social scientists in a network of natural scientists? And there are lots of questions. How do you measure excellent science? Do you take the H index? Then most of us are out of the system because our H index is normally 10 times less high than, let's say, microbiologists have. Do you take publications in Science and Nature, which is also something, I mean, we have done one, whatever, but normally it's not really where we publish our stuff, and it's also not the most accepting for social science research. So there are many traditional indicators of scientific excellence that put social scientists in the end of the bandwagon. So we are always kind of then in the end. So we have to engage in discussion also to what is actually excellence in scientific research. The same that we all discuss in our different universities. Second, the big thing is co-production and co-design. And that means science should be produced and designed together with stakeholders, whatever they are. And this has a tradition, many of you have worked on these issues, has a tradition at the local level for the last 10, 20, 30 years that we do research together, we design it when we analyze local issues together with stakeholders. We involve the farmers, we involve the fishers, we involve recreation people, government people. But what does it mean at the global level? What they have done in Future Earth is they have a scientific committee and they have a user committee, which is called engagement committee. It's a great idea. It's the idea to bring in 18 people who are in a committee from society. There's one from industry, there's one from banks, there's one from government, there's one person from NGOs or whatever. So they have this kind of 18 people. And the task for these people is to also assess the scientist plans that we are bringing forward. So when we want to have a social science project, this engagement committee is judging whether this project is a good project, whether the questions are the right questions. Which is on the one hand great. On the other hand, it's a big problem for social science. We have, for example, many of us are critical of capitalism, for example. But how do you deal then with an engagement committee in which you have representatives from industry? It's not necessarily Monsanto. Now they have somebody from Google, which is kind of one particular part of industry. But these kind of corporations are then having an opinion about the value of our science plans as social scientists. So I think it's a very challenging thing for us as our community. It's much different for biologists or ecologists. I mean, they're much more politically neutral in a sense than what we do in our kind of research. Then we have to be all solution-oriented, which I think is great. I mean, it's really, we should get out of the ivory towers, we should get out of the Chesterfield surveys, we should really get solutions. That's very important. But that means also that in a way, our research is less theory-driven, like it theoretically has been in the last whatever 100 years. It's much more driven by resolving societal questions. And the societal questions, the way they're currently being defined, are, for example, water, our climate, our coastal zone planning. So they're all questions that are very much focused to certain media, certain areas, where social scientists become then very fragmented. So there is a future possible that we become water scholars, water governance, food governance, whatever, carbon governance, coastal zone governance, etc., etc. This is what it happens. I mean, I've worked on many different projects where natural scientists have to find the question, and then they said, Frank, we need a governance person. And then whatever, we find a governance person, which is all fine. But the point is, in a sense, that it's difficult for us to have these kind of meetings. It's difficult to have a meeting where we discuss the larger questions of what does it mean for democracy, what does it mean for effectiveness of institutions, etc., etc. These big questions we can't answer if we are totally fragmented and become these hyphenated governance experts. Variety of communities. So this is kind of a challenge. I think this is a trend is going this direction. We have to find solutions and we have to find responses to this. Geographic balance is of course part of this, but there are many, many studies also who show, many studies who show, I mean, that it's very difficult in a sense how to increase geographic representation. I mean, I had some discussions with some of you here also. From the Earth System Governance Project, we work very hard in a sense to really become a more globally representative organization. It is difficult. It has to do with capacity, it has to do with money, in a sense, or to build up research capacities, have partially also to do with the questions that are being asked. So here also the question is, how will Future Earth do it? I was at a meeting where all chairs of all global change research programs were represented. There was only one project that was run by somebody from a developing country. There was an Indian a professor who worked on coastal zone planning. All other projects, they have people from the South in the scientific steering committees. The chairs are by different, always in a sense, from industrialized countries, which has to do a lot with the money. It has to do with, this is kind of where the time is there available, being made available to work on these issues, because it's all unpaid activities. Interdisciplinarity is, of course, what everybody says, integrated social sciences. We have to watch out, I believe, to the dominance of quantitative approaches, because this is what everybody understands. I mean, numbers are always clear. This is kind of what brings to raises the attention among other communities. So we have to be careful that we will kind of be dominated by this. And as I said, also social science is secondary science in these problems. And then the last slide on this set, and then I come up with a concluding slide, is this principle of integration. And I like to have this as kind of what the conclusion is. So Future Earth should draw on the expertise in natural and social science, engineering, humanities, professions, planning and law, complemented by disciplinary excellence that contributes to integrate projects with a focus on intersection, etc., etc., etc. So this reminded me of this story about the camel, which is a horse designed by a committee. And I think that's kind of what it is. In a sense, this last sentence means we want to achieve it all. And I think it's not really clear whether you can achieve all. I think sometimes you have to make choices. Sometimes you really have to choose the one over the other. And we as social scientists, we have to be very active and engaged and careful in a sense. I mean, this is kind of the future. We have to be part of this, but we have to find ways of protecting, preserving, but also how we can contribute. because the issues are there, they are tremendously important, and we have to think how we can contribute to these issues. And on this note, I just, the advertisement block in a sense is that one community that's working on this issue is the Earth System Governance Project, that is, all the organizers are part of it, which is the attempt of bringing together the governance scholars. So it's kind of a global research alliance with partners in all continents right now, where we try to bring together the governance scholars from all countries to try to analyze all these questions that I have mentioned. And our secretariat is based in Sweden at Lund University, but we have also partners in a variety of other countries. And I invite everybody who's not part of it to become part of this community. We have a website, we have a Facebook site, we have a LinkedIn site, we have a Twitter account, we have a website and everything. So if you're interested, just talk to me. It's a very open network where everybody can participate. And our next big conference is in Norwich on 1st till 3rd of July, which is not the World Cup, it's in the middle of the World Cup. We have checked this very carefully. So you're all invited to join the discussions, and the conference thereafter will be on Australia, and the conference thereafter will be in Africa. That's what the plan. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for this excellent navigation in global environment and climate research. Now we have some time for a few questions, so I hope there are many. Please say your name and where you are from. Yes, I think it's Lisa there.
Thanks so much, Lisa Dilling from University of Colorado. I just wanted to, this is more a comment, your last few slides on the challenges of working in this space for social scientists completely mirrored our discussion at lunch at our table. I mean, and I guess maybe it's a question for you. This is happening in a microcosm within universities as well, that are having interdisciplinary programs, having environmental studies programs in my case. I mean, literally the same words that you had there, the quantitative focus and how are other approaches respected and so forth within that interdisciplinary environment. I guess, I mean, what frustrates me is that this is the way that things are going, and yet we encounter this tension in our own institutions where we work all the time still. Are there some ways to move past this, or kind of engage it in a productive way, so that we can feel confident in embarking in this new project of basically being an interdisciplinary community? I think we have to feel safe in our home institutions to do this, as well as engaging in this in a broader sense as a research agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes.
Yes,
please.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're fully right. I mean, I have the same in Amsterdam, where I am based. I mean, we have a discussion about linking or merging the natural science faculties. I will be part of them, and then I will be, as a political scientist, probably part of one of the largest natural science faculties in Europe, actually. So, and then we have all these discussions at the local level with different degrees of perceptions. I mean, there's some social science and some natural science who are more radical, more cooperative in the one or the other way. So I think I have two answers. Now, one is, I think, for the global network, but maybe also for the local network at universities or in countries or wherever you're based, is I think it's important to maintain collaboration among the social scientists, because I think if we are losing the opportunity and the space in the arena to ask this big social science question, then we're out of business. I think then we're just becoming poor social scientists. I think it's very important that we kind of maintain open space for discuss the big questions of where our societies are going. This is like democracy, whatever, legitimacy, justice, all these big issues. You can't address these issues when you're sitting in a project that discusses whatever the carbon cycle or the hydrogen cycle, whatever. You can't discuss these things. So this, I think, very important to have it. And for Future Earth, it could mean, I mean, we have one proposal I supported, actually was called Future Societies. Because there was now a fast track initiatives where all kind of teams could together proposals for getting some fast-track money. And it was kind of not really, and we just, at some point, we just, as a social science, we said, let's put together one proposal just among ourselves. We had a proposal for future ocean, future water, future health, and then we have now one proposal out there for future society, which is then kind of more this bigger question. So I think this is what we have to do. But on the other hand, I think it's also fascinating to work together. I mean, I do this also, and I have really, it's kind of one of the things I enjoy a lot. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the Anthropocene. We had a fascinating workshop in January on the Anthropocene, which was driven by the natural science, the IGBP community, because they are doing a synthesis on the Anthropocene, because they kind of invented the term in a way, and then invited a couple of social scientists there, and we had great discussions. So I'm kind of working on a paper now, it's called Down to Earth, which is kind of about breaking down the concept of Anthropocene, what it really means, I mean, where it really works together. And we had one team of authors, there was a natural scientist who only works on nitrogen cycle. He was really kind of said that all the problems of the world can be resolved if you fix nitrogen. This kind of, he came from this perspective. And then we brought together we had somebody, an ecological economist from India who works as farmer in Nepal and food security in a sense. And in a sense, they work on the same issues. No? And it's fascinating to sit together in a small group and bring together the nitrogen. I mean, I always said, do we need a ministry of nitrogen? Anyway, so, and then bring together those people who work on food security, rural livelihood, and these kind of issues, and then bring them together and let them write the paper together. And this is what everybody there in this room experience as a great experience, and maybe even bringing forward also generating new ideas. And I think this is one of the advantage of this concept of the Anthropocene, that it helps you to see things differently, and it helps you to make connections between nitrogen and food security, which, I mean, everyone understands it in a way, but bringing together these two communities in one room, I think is something that's very useful, and I think this is what we should do. I think it's very important. I think we should do both. We should have meetings, only social scientists, big questions, social science, societies, future of capitalism, whatever it is, but then at the same time also have another meeting where we discuss nitrogen. I think that's kind of, so it's kind of a double answer. So.
Okay, yes, quick one, Ulrika.
Thank you. I've been pondering on a question for quite some time, and perhaps you're the person to enlighten me on it. When we look at solving the global climate change problem, for instance, we talked about the 2015 framework, and the governance structure is part of that. How would we organize ourselves in solving that problem? I was wondering, how much does it influence where we come from? What is our own context? Do we come from a democracy, direct democracy, or perhaps from some other organizational form in our host countries at home as nationals? How much does that influence the kind of solution we see as feasible for solving a global problem? And how much influence do you have as scientists in providing solutions that might actually work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I've not done research on this, but I have a hypothesis. And we had at one point, we had, many of you were part of this, we had a European research program. Only Europeans, in a sense, was called the Global Governance Project, and we just happened to be Europeans. We put a book together, and one of the questions we had is, to what extent are the conclusions and the findings of this book influenced by the fact that we all have a European passport, or based in Europe, in a sense? No? It was an interesting discussion. I mean, in the sense, the conclusion was it's not that important. So we have, like, in the section we wrote a very short section. But hypotheses are, for example, multilateralism. I mean, Europeans, from decision makers, from the government, they're used to work in Brussels. They're used to always negotiate and to accept some authorities above the nation state. So it's kind of the way how bureaucrats, government people are growing up in Europe. This can also influence the way how you see, you might feel less threatened by international negotiations, international multilateral institutions, because you have this domestic experience in your DNA to some extent, less from other countries. Another example is that many of the institutions that are being discussed at the global level, including some of them ones I had, we have them actually in Europe. I mean, we have a European Parliament, and for this idea of this global forum of civil society, there is in Europe the Economic and Social Council. It is kind of this idea of bringing together people from different societal groups sitting there in Brussels, and they are part of the European decision-making process. So a lot of these ideas have been developed also in Europe, and might therefore also be easier for Europeans to accept. And there are some other examples where you can think, I mean, that national experiences are influencing then the way how you're more open to certain discussions, or you're more close to certain discussions. So I think I think for academics is certainly it's an important point. I think what I think I mentioned yesterday a bit. I think the global change community is largely driven by 20% of the global population. I mean that's the largest part. If you go to global change meetings, and I suspect it has an influence. It has an influence also on the choice of questions. Like equity, as I mentioned, I think equity would have a much stronger status if it would be, if other countries would be much more influential in these discussions. I think that's one way how the passport or the funding context is influencing the way what it is. It's also part, actually, I mean, if I might put you on the spot in a sense, has to do with funding. I mean, a lot of us are living from, or we apply for, like European Union funding, which is increasingly based on European interest. I mean, that's how the calls are being written. I mean, they're kind of questions that are written from European bureaucrats sitting there, and they are largely questions that European politicians want to know at different levels. So then we have to adjust to it and kind of answer these questions, because this is what funds our programs. So, I mean, a little bit exaggerating maybe. So I think this has a lot of influence. And this, again, then determines the papers, because then we publish, and we publish in international journals, and then we become a mainstream. Whatever so I think these matters have a tremendous influence. And I think what could help, of course, a lot also to foster compromise. I mean, negotiators are always dealing with the other negotiators, but I think to bring together academic communities can have a tremendous impact. And we do this. I mean, the Earth System Governance Project, we do this. But even our conference, for financial reasons, are dominated by so many others, also natural efforts. So, but we have done statistics, actually. I mean, I think Norway and Sweden are per capita really the strongest contributors. No? And I think to put Swedish taxpayer money in helping to bring in people from different countries, different continents, could really generate new types of debates. And in generating new types of debate, maybe also help with your day-to-day problems of getting a climate treaty. So I think that could be an interesting way forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there are more questions, but we should move on to our second speaker. But first, applaud for Frank.